Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. And by the way, you can and should follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. I'm actually going to start with Parler, Caleb. I'm curious to hear your take on this. You're on Twitter, of course. You got an active and substantial following over there. So you're a resident of that platform, but I'm sure that you, like many of us, are also concerned about the U.S. government and big tech companies' successful attempts so far to crack down on a true variety of speech when it comes to political issues and the news, with Parler getting banned, getting blocked, and now them making a resurgence. I'm just turning it over to you, Caleb. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I hate to be cynical, but, you know, it's all dressed up in politics. Like, this is this righteous move on their part. You know, the big tech giants, they're just morally outraged by what happened on Capitol Hill, and you know, they just have to shut down Parler. But I'm sorry, you know, I mean, if McDonald's, you know, had to shut down a rival hamburger company, and they said, oh, it's because that company supports Donald Trump, and everyone just needs to buy their hamburgers from us because this other company is just morally bad. Would we buy this? I mean, this just seems like cracking down on your competitor. This seems like, you know, securing your monopoly to me. That's what it seems like. You know, I really have a hard time buying that this is just some bold political move. I think the nightmare of Twitter and the nightmare of Facebook and the nightmare of YouTube and Google and is what's going to happen anyway, which is eventually they're going to lose their monopoly. Eventually, people are going to, you know, use other social media outlets, and they won't have an absolute monopoly, and that's going to happen, and they know that, and it's only a matter of time. So, yes, they want to dress it up as this political statement, and they're taking a stand, but at the end of the day, what are they doing? They're shutting down a potential rival and competitor at a moment when more and more people are getting sick and tired of the censorship and the way they treated the Hunter Biden story and suppressed it, the way that they're blatantly partisan in American politics, the way that so many people are being shut off. It looks to me like they're realizing that it's only a matter of time before their monopoly goes.
See, I don't know if they know that. I mean, look, I agree with you that this does come across as looking at it as you're shutting down a competitor. By the same token, the argument that is being made is that the competitor is basically harboring a lot of people that were there to foment that strike, to foment that attack. I got to be honest, that attack could have been fomented on Facebook, Twitter, Google. It could have been using any of these platforms to make that attack, unless all of the platforms, including private communications, are being monitored. And that's a whole nother jump at the shark. Meaning, shutting down Parler is one thing, but to pretend as if people aren't going to communicate using whatever platform they can get their hands on for the communication, it will require mass surveillance pretty much at all times, even in the sense of private communications. And I don't buy for a moment that Google, Twitter, Facebook are going to be held to the standard to which they set for Parler. What do you think about that? I mean, I don't buy this idea that Parler is the only application that it can be used for something like this. And because I don't buy it, that it's the only, you know, that this is the only thing that can be used for, that you have all of these other applications that can be used for it also, then it seems that the goal is trying to, let's say, mitigate conversation that may run afoul of the political institutions that we currently have. Now, what do you think about that? I mean, it's not just Parler, which is kind of my point. And if you're going to shut it down, you got to shut all of it down.
Yeah, right. And I mean, there were people who participated in Trump's big rally that were on Facebook. There were people participating in that rally on Twitter. And I mean, yeah, the idea that that app is responsible for it. I mean, that app perhaps was less willing to censor pro-Trump views, and I think that's why a lot of Trump folks were using it. But the idea that that app is somehow responsible for what happened on Capitol Hill because of what I don't buy that. I just don't buy it. And And it seems like a lot of moral grandstanding. And at the end of the day, I compare this to the printing press. When the Catholic Church, started using the printing press in Europe, right? Johannes Gutenberg. At first, the Catholic Church thought it was great. They got the printing press. We could print, every village can have their little village Bible. We can print our indulgences. It was great. But it was only a matter of time before critics of the Catholic Church got their hands on the printing press. And that was a big turning point. And, this is how it works. You can talk about it in business. It works this way, too. If a company develops a competitive, technological breakthrough that puts them ahead, give it time, all their competitors will catch up with them. It's only a matter of time. And I think it is only a matter of time before there are rivals. Look, the reason that there was such a freak out about TikTok was just, oh, my goodness. There was just a freak out about it was because here is an app. Here's a social media platform that people all across the United States are using that didn't originate in Silicon Valley. It originated in China. And even though, they made it not available on the Chinese mainland so that it wouldn't be subject to censorship, even though they made a point of allowing all kinds of anti-Chinese stuff, you can find all kinds of stuff about Hong Kong protesters and Uyghurs all over TikTok, didn't matter. They freaked out about TikTok. And the reason they freaked out is because they don't control it. It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time before alternatives to Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Google are out there that are originating from forces other than Silicon Valley. It sounds wacky, it sounds tinfoil hatty, but it is a matter of public record that the reason that the United States excelled in the computer revolution was because of strategic decisions from American intelligence. They realized this was something we had the resources to invest in. The Soviet Union did not, and the NSA and the CIA and other intelligence agencies gave lots of loans and money to IBM and Apple and the companies that eventually set up Google and other things. And the Silicon Valley explosion wasn't a result of the free market. Al Gore very famously said, we invented the internet, and everyone kind of laughed at him. But what he was pointing to was that there was a strategic decision by the American government to allocate resources to allow the United States to be the leader of the computer revolution. And this goes all the way back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Cold War strategist. He wrote a book about the technotronic era and how, increasingly those who control the means of communication would be able to craft and socially engineer and control the world. And it's largely understood that the computer revolution was a result of Cold War strategy and the military, and we need to just remember this. And it's only a matter of time before the technology that was innovated by the United States and the West is in the hands of other forces as well.
And this is, the book that you're talking about, The Technotronic Era, haven't read it, but I've heard about it. This was published in 1970, the year after the formation of ARPANET. You were talking about, the intelligence communities, and not just infiltration, but active support from the very beginnings of the internet. ARPANET founded in 1969, so the year before that was founded. Again, ARPANET coming from the Advanced Research Projects Agency. Probably familiar, most of the listeners, with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's also, of course, IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. So the roots, the common roots there are very deep. And for many who followed this for years are disquieting. We could talk about that for a long time. There are two other topics of conversation I wanted to bring up. One is AOC, also calling for censorship. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez basically calling for the creation of some review process or some long-term sea change in American media policy, trying to affect what publications are able to say. Basically, the rhetoric around this right now, the speech is you're trying to cut down on misinformation or disinformation. The substance or the actuality would be more censorship of competing stories. And I'm guessing that partly, I was saying this earlier on in the show, partly this is aimed at the New York Post and their publication of a lot of the revelations on the Hunter Biden story back during the election cycle last year. I want to come back to that, though. Why do you think, Caleb, it seems to me that in the last half decade, there has been a deep change in the American sort of public conscience, where with Snowden and with Assange, the revelations happening early in the 2010s, a lot of the public was worried about the NSA. They were very cautious of using Facebook and other social media platforms that were, sort of in the making, still fairly young at the time. And they were very concerned about their data being accessed, being breached. It was kind of an iconic moment at the time. I remember a lot of folks being very worried about this. It seems like that conversation has died down, and what it has been replaced by, at least in terms of how the news media is talking about this, are fears of white supremacists and terrorists using these platforms to plan more political, militaristic events online. Now, admittedly, some of this is very recent. This is after the breaching of the Capitol, but it seems like that balance of conversation has shifted, and we've forgotten about the Snowden revelations in large part, or at least gotten used to them. Caleb, why do you think that is? Am I right there? Am I wrong? What's your take on that? And why do you think that's happened if you admit that it has, if you think that it has? Caleb.
Well, I think that if you listen to mainstream outlets, that's the way the conversation has certainly changed. And I think that the reason for that would be probably that, in American politics, the divisions have gotten more intense, and that what was originally kind of a nonpartisan issue, you had people on the left, people on the right who were concerned about Edward Snowden's revelations and privacy, has now turned into a partisan issue, right? If people say WikiLeaks, immediately you say, people immediately think of, interfering in U.S. elections, Assange, Russia, and they've turned it into a partisan issue. So most people on the liberal camp, immediately you say WikiLeaks, they immediately have a prepared script in their mind. They have a thought-stopping ritual they engage in that says, this is bad, this is Trump stuff, don't talk about this, you must be a Trumper. Whereas, people on the right, they get a little confused because the right tends to be the home of, more authoritarian stuff, more support for the military-industrial complex and more support for U.S. interventionism and such, and you have more of a military mindset. You have got Mike Pompeo and others, but yet it's on the right, on the dissident right, that you have some sympathy. So there are divisions on the right, divisions on the left, but unfortunately, as things become a partisan issue, people are less willing to think with a clear head, and they start rooting for whichever team is theirs and waving their team's flag, and it's a little bit disappointing.
You're right. You know what? We got to go into a break, but you're exactly right, I think. And I think a lot of this has to do with what happened in 2016 and the conversation around fake news and the cultural self-consciousness that, admittedly not fully self-conscious, but we came to think of ourselves as more and more being in these two divided camps. And I think that crowded out, that way of approaching the internet and that way of approaching the conversation online crowded out the Snowden revelations. And admittedly a couple of years old at that point, but still it was recent enough that if that hadn't happened, we might have been thinking in those terms more now. And sadly, I don't think we are. Anyway, we need to go into a break. We're joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Follow him on Twitter at Caleb Maupin. Read his articles at calebmaupin.com. We will be back with him on the other side of this break in just a minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts the rise of prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Again, Caleb, welcome to the show, man.
Sure, glad to be here as always.
So one of the questions I wanted to get into that I thought was really interesting, you made a video that was basically a message to Trump supporters from a communist. What is the message that you wanted to impart to Trump supporters, and why?
Well, I said, look, I don't hate you. I disagree with you on a number of key points, but I think we're all really angry about what's happening in the country and the power of big corporations and monopolies. And I'd like you to examine what genuine socialism is really about with a clear head, because we're all upset. And yeah, that was generally my message to Trump supporters, and it got quite a strong reaction. A number of Trump supporters actually did watch it. It made its way through a number of Trump-supporting and QAnon-supporting websites. And on top of that, it got quite a reaction from the left. Many leftists thought it was quite brave of me to do, and I was expecting quite a negative reaction to it. But instead, I got many leftists who said it was a brilliantly done thing. Many people messaged me, and they said, I sent this to my Trump-supporting relatives. I sent this to my cousins. I sent this to my mom and dad, my brother, my uncle. And that a lot of leftists said, thank goodness you're starting this conversation, and thank goodness you have made a video introducing Marxism and disagreeing and challenging Trump supporters, not in an accusatory and hostile way, but in a way of understanding how angry they are about a lot of the problems in the country that those of us on the left are also mad about. And so I've gotten a very, very positive reaction to it, I would say, overall. Obviously, a lot of disagreement from all sides. A lot of leftists thought I was too soft on the Trump supporters. I should be scolding them more. A lot of Trump supporters said, well, you might be friendly here, but you're still a dirty, rotten communist. But overall, I got a pretty positive reaction. I'm glad I did it.
Okay, so I took completely in favor of the parties reaching across lines, but I'm going to bring this up. Isn't the last time, at least on the sort of international public memory, isn't the last time that we saw the right wing embracing socialism? You know where I'm going with this. Wasn't that in the 20s and 30s with the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany? Wasn't that with the rise of the Nazis? I mean, admittedly, that's an obvious response to bring up. But Caleb, I'm curious about how you would respond to that. Aren't you worried about courting that kind of approach?
Well, no. I mean, in my video, I made very clear that I am for the rights of immigrant workers. I talked about Black Lives Matter and my support for that. I talked about a number of issues where I disagree with folks, and I certainly would not be in favor of pandering to racism or ethnic bigotry or national chauvinism or anything like that. But actually, when you talk about that, what's interesting is that on the right in Europe, not in the United States, but historically in Europe, there has been a long history of criticizing capitalism from the right. And actually, right-wing anti-capitalism, I would say, predates left-wing anti-capitalism. Before capitalism had really even gotten going, you already had the Catholic Church condemning it on some level, saying it was a threat to the traditional feudal hierarchies and such, and that a right-wing critique of capitalism certainly didn't start in the 1930s with the Nazis. I mean, it really goes back. You can talk about Oswald Spengler. You can talk about Julius Evola. And that and there is Ernst Juncker, and that there was a right-wing, traditionalist, ultra-authoritarian critique of capitalism. That's been around for a long time, and that's not what I was putting forward in my video at all. I mean, I advocate an egalitarian society with equal rights for everyone. But right-wing anti-capitalism, I mean, it's something it's worth looking into, right? I mean, in the United States, we think of right-wing and capitalism as being synonymous. There are a lot of thinkers throughout history who have said that, hey, if we're trying to reinforce tradition and hierarchy and obedience and authority and religion and morality, maybe we should question a society where kind of money comes first and everyone can just start a business as they want and rules and structure are put aside. And right-wing anti-capitalism is a long-standing trend. And oddly, I think the Nazis on some level broke with it, even though they called themselves National Socialists. If you looked at Nazi Germany, it was a pretty free market economy. Before coming to power, Hitler sat down with Hallemer Schacht and the Krupps and the Tysons and all the wealthy families and made a deal with them. And then there was the infamous Night of the Long Knives, where he took out the more anti-capitalist wing of his party and killed them all, right? I mean, and you had the execution of Ernst Rem and Gregor Strasser, and the more, fanatical wing of the Nazi party was exterminated. So I don't think the Nazis were really anti-capitalist when it comes down to it. But that's a complex question, and it kind of shows how limited discourse is in the United States.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Caleb, because that is something that some people think, that just because they put socialist in the name, that all of a sudden these guys were socialists. It became very clear that any level of socialism that Hitler was talking about was basically not socialism. I mean, you require, like, if you're going to say, all right, we're going to get rid of a large part of the population and then we're going to become socialists, they missed the boat. You know what I mean? It's not built around this notion of person and physical features. Is built around this notion of class. Hitler entirely missed that point, or didn't care about that point. Caleb, from the standpoint of his supporters, what were you trying to communicate to them from the standpoint of anger, that the left does get this kind of righteous indignation that is within the population? But what is the disconnect between the anger that the left feel versus the anger that the right feel? And is there a disconnect between those two things at all? Meaning, on the day that the Proud Boys are fighting Antifa activists in the public, 4,400 people died from COVID. That seems like the most weirdest and the most bizarre. Like, if you're watching Star Wars, for example, and you have Luke fighting Darth Vader, or not Luke fighting Darth Vader, you have Darth Vader or the person who's becoming Darth Vader having a fight with, I can't think of his name, the guy who eventually trains Luke Skywalker. And they're in the middle of a lava pit, and there's fire going all around them, and these two are fighting as if nothing else is going on. And it's like the world is burning around you, and you guys are still fighting. That's what it felt like. You had, but less significant, more insignificant. Basically, 4,400 people dropped dead from COVID while these two groups are out there fighting. It seems like they miss the point. What is your way of trying to communicate to them to say, look, the anger is not just held by you. There's a large part of the population that is angry and pissed off. And how do you mend the two? What was your pathway of trying to reach out?
Well, when it gets down to it, populism has always been of the left, right? I mean, what does the Communist Manifesto say? I mean, it's the ideas, the working class, the majority of society taking control of the major means of production and organizing them to serve public good. It's an idea of the people rising up against the wealthy elite and restructuring the economy to serve the interests of the people, not the profits of private owners. This is the original populism. It is the broad masses of people against the elite. I mean, the left-wing populism is populism. However, unfortunately, there has been a huge amount of confusion in the United States, most especially since the beginning of the Cold War. And left-wing politics, for some, and for a lot of the voices that dominate left-wing politics, has become about protecting intellectuals from the inferior rabble or something like that. Meanwhile, it's been the right that has usurped and pretended to be the populists. But at the end of the day, the economic policies put forward by our right wing here in the United States are economic policies of neoliberalism, cutbacks, looting middle America, destroying the lives of working families. And when it really gets down to it, it is, the economic policies of class struggle and socialism and Eugene Debs and Gus Hall and William C. Foster and the folks who built the labor movement and the folks who struggled to defeat the slave owners, and its populism is really on the left. And that's what I was trying to get across. And I see on the left, this kind of reinvention of leftism to be about liberals and intellectuals in the middle class. And then I see the right, pretending to be the populists when at the end of the day, their economic policies are devastating for middle America and for the broad majority while protecting the ultra-rich. So I wanted to make a populist appeal to working class people who might support Donald Trump on the basis that the mainstream media is against him and he's fighting, they see him as fighting for the little guy, even though he's not.
I mean, okay, so one quick thing, we got to go out here, but manufacturing specifically, I've heard you talk about this. I know this is on your mind, increasing general productive capacities, and of course that's a larger part of the communist platform in general. But it seems like the right, you're talking about usurpation. I don't know if I would put it in those terms, but I get where you're going with that. Isn't the right, don't they sort of own that side of the conversation, bringing manufacturing back to the States, admittedly with some racist overtones, but still this idea of increasing capital production at home? Caleb, I'm just curious about your take on that. How do you see the left possibly taking that bit of rhetoric or that general approach back? Do you see that happening, Caleb?
Well, the AFL-CIO and the labor movement have long been against NAFTA and the trade deals, and against the World Trade Organization and against the internationalization of the economy and globalization in a way that devastates American jobs and creates a global race to the bottom where workers in manufacturing are competing with workers all over the world for who will work for the lowest wages, who will be the most productive and get the least in return. I think there's a long history of the left, opposing that and critiquing that. I'm sure the right has opposed it for different reasons and, thinks it's communism or something. But I don't think that the right wing necessarily owns it. Perhaps they own it in a nativist way. They own the nationalistic rhetoric that says the UN is a communist conspiracy or something like that. But when it gets down to it, it is organized labor. It is the left that has been critical of these trade deals and critical of the internationalization of the economy in this way. So I think it's more complex. And one thing, though, I will say is that, the ultra-rich, the folks that very much want a global, open international system, as Anne-Marie Slaughter of the Hillary Clinton State Department put it, those folks often will dress up their advocacy of policies that are devastating middle America and destroying the lives of working families in socially liberal language. They'll say we're building a more culturally inclusive world. This is about breaking down barriers and opposing racism and sexism and being more enlightened in our global community. And that the language of social liberalism has very much been hijacked. At this point, you've got some of the wealthiest families in the world really pushing for quote unquote inclusive capitalism. That's been a big push we're seeing by some of the wealthiest, and the Rockefellers and the Trilateral Commission and some of the ultra rich certainly have hijacked the language of social liberalism to push their agenda of globalization. So I can understand why people may be confused.
It's a kind of ideological divide and conquer tactic. We need to talk about that more some other time. We're out of time now, though. Caleb, thank you for joining us.
Sure thing.
We're joined for these last two segments by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author, whose new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Check him out on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. We're going into a break. We're taking calls on the other side of this break. 202-521-1320. Be back with you on the other side in just a moment.
Fault lines.